My wife, Jill, heard me make a response to the charge that I was bitterly opposed to Ellen G. White. And so she asked me if I could reproduce my response so that other people might share it. So this is an approximate repetition of what I said yesterday to a visitor who thought that perhaps I was bitterly opposed to Ellen White. I am bitterly opposed to Ellen White being used as a Bible. And I'm also bitterly opposed to Ellen White being viewed as infallible. I have several reasons, but the first reason is that that was her position over and over again. She said, don't quote my words as long as you live till you know what the Bible says. She forbade people to use her writings in the pulpit. And she also said, as for infallibility, I've never claimed it. The only source of truth without an error is the Bible. When she wrote Spiritual Gifts, which had a lot of autobiographical material, she sent out 400 special copies to contemporaries. And she said, if you find any mistakes, please let me know so I can correct them in the next edition. F.M. Wilcox, very great Christian, who was editor of the Review for years, he wrote a book called The Testimony of Jesus, and he had a chapter in there on inspiration and infallibility. He said, never make the mistake of claiming for Ellen White more than she claimed for herself. She never claimed infallibility. Here is my attitude to Ellen White. I believe she was a godly woman whom God used in a very remarkable way. I would be dead but for Ellen White. And the 2 PhDs that I have, I would not have but for Ellen White. And my emphasis on the gospel of justification by faith does stem in part from my reading of Ellen White, especially Selected Messages, Volume 1, 350 to 400. She regarded justification by faith as the sweetest melody from human lips. And she also claimed that she'd been impressed repeatedly on the topic of the imputed righteousness of Christ. She said, I've made it the burden of nearly every discourse I've given the people. Of course, this is after 1888. That would not have been true beforehand. There's a great deal of law and emphasis on sanctification in the testimonies for the church in the early volumes, though not as much as some might think, because there's also gospel there. I love her quotation in the 9th volume, 222, where she says, we ourselves are stumbling and falling, failing in speech and action to represent Christ, falling and rising again, despairing and hoping. Anyone who wrote that must have known the gospel. When I was 10 years of age, I began to read Steps to Christ. I was an Episcopalian, or an Anglican, we call them here. Episcopalian, we call them in America. But someone had given my mother Steps to Christ, and I remember reading the chapter on the love of God in that beautiful book. You know, that book's had circulation, about 100 million copies. It's been translated into just about every language. It's the only book Ellen White wrote that was published by an outside firm, first of all, Fleming and Revel, which published Wydell Moody's materials. But it's a wonderful book. There's nothing in it about investigative judgment. It's all gospel, and it blessed me. I was lent the book Great Controversy when I was a teenager, 13 or 14, and I loved that book. I'd never heard about the Roman destruction of Jerusalem. I'd never heard of John Wycliffe or Martin Luther or John Knox or Zwingli or Latimer. I'd never heard of William Miller. So I loved that book. It had a great deal to do with my becoming an Adventist. Only in much later years did I find that, like every book anyone's ever written, there were errors there. There were mistakes there. There were failings there. Ellen White made mistakes in Great Controversy about history, about theology. She quoted Josiah Litch on August 11, 1840, but nothing happened on that day. Her contemporaries thought something happened. Historians say nothing happened. Josiah Litch gave it up. She wrote a whole chapter on the French Revolution, which embarrassed the General Conference greatly, about 1900. They spent a lot of money trying to find support for some of her historical statements there, but the whole chapter is inaccurate. Revelation 11 has nothing to do with the French Revolution. Search all the classics of commentaries on Revelation, or even read my own book, Crisis, Volume 2. But I still regard the book as a great spiritual classic, and it upheld Christ and the gospel to me, particularly in the pages about Martin Luther. When I say that I would be dead but for Ellen White, I should tell you that after reading Great Controversy, someone offered me messages to young people. Now, that book wouldn't appeal to many young people today, but I was a reader who took several hours a day, every day, to read. And I read some classics like Scott and Dickens and Thackeray, that sort of classic, but I also read a great deal of novels and fiction. And when I was lent messages to young people, I sensed a purity in that book that I had never noticed in any other book I'd ever read except the Bible, which I read from cover to cover between the age of 9 and 12. But there was something different in messages to young people that seemed so wholesome spiritually. But she was against the reading of fiction, and I was an addict. If I had not taken her counsel at that time, I doubt I could have worked in 3 universities. I doubt that I could have got 4 degrees, including 2 PhDs. But when I read her condemnation of fiction, although I told other people who advised me to give up such reading, that I would never give it up. But there was something in messages to young people that said to me, this is a message from God to you, Des Ford. Give up fiction. Now today, I would say there are some works of fiction that are much better than most sermons. There are some works of fiction that are worthy of close reading. But at her time, the vast majority of pulp, cheap novels were terrible. And I have to admit that a good deal that I read was in that category. So I gave it up. But I also read in the same book that the law of God is written on every nerve and sinew of our being, and that the body's a temple of God. But I, like most children, love lollies, sweets, biscuits, cake. My mother wouldn't give these things to me, but my grandmother did. So I haunted the house of my grandmother with no other excuse than to get lollies and biscuits and cake year after year. But I read in Message to Young People that our body belongs to God. And she also recommended being a vegetarian. I was a meat eater. So at the age of about 14, I became a vegetarian, and I gave up eating sweets and biscuits and cake. I've avoided all such now for over 70 years. And if I hadn't done so, I think I would have been dead by now. Anyway, about the age of 15, I had found a job, moved from Counsel to Sydney, and was working in a newspaper office, and had been promoted to a very lowly job in the editorial of that great firm, which had a building about 15 stories high, 3 stories under the ground. And there I began to scribble. I began to write fiction articles, and they were published in a magazine called The World's Liar, and I had one published in the Daily Sun. But about the same time, I was continuing to read Ellen White. I wasn't reading fiction, but I wrote it, and I had several publications. I should confess that that magazine, The World's News, is known by some people as The World's Liar, but I was thrilled when I went 50 feet beneath the ground and saw the great presses rolling out the magazine, which had my fiction stories in them. Anyway, I haunted the second-hand shops of Sydney, got every book by Ellen White that I could find. I loved Ministry of Healing. You know, in that book she said, inactivity is a fruitful cause of disease. And I had begun to find that because of my close work, too much reading, my own health was suffering. So I began to exercise, and I jogged for 50 years. You don't have to jog, but you do have to move. We were made to move. And Ellen White was so right when she said inactivity is a fruitful cause of disease. I got a second-hand copy of Life Sketches and learned about Avondale. And I began to pray about Avondale College. I wanted to go there. My mother didn't want me to even mention it. She needed me for income. My father had left our family when I was 8 or 9, and most of my money that I earned, except 5 shillings a week, went to my mother. But marvellously, in the providence of God, a man who had been an Adventist minister thought I should go, and he offered to pay my first year's fees. He wasn't able to keep it up. He got into financial problems. And the board of Avondale wanted me to leave. But I went back year after year for 4 years till I graduated, thinking each new year that maybe I wouldn't be able to stay. But you know, when I went to that college for the first time, I met a PhD. His name was William G. Murdoch. He was a wonderful gentleman, a saintly Christian, and we became friends very early. I did research work for him, took classes for him, and he would not permit the board to move me out of Avondale. He just said, Des, please try and do a little more. So I worked in the cafeteria, serving and things like that. I worked in the orchard, in the garden, and I worked in the library. And year after year, he kept me at Avondale. And one day he said to me, Des, you should consider going to our seminary. Well, I knew nothing about the seminary, but he knew nothing about my finances. I got 2 shillings a week from my grandmother, That covered soap and stamps. But I didn't have money to go to Sydney, let alone go to America, where I understood our seminary was. But I went to my college room, I'm still a teenager, and I did what you should not do if you want to know the will of God. But I opened the Bible at random and said, Lord, is it right? Do you want me to go overseas to the seminary? And the first words I read from 2 Kings chapter 11 were, this is the thing that thou shalt do. So when I married Gwen Booth, not long after leaving college, I said to her, we mustn't spend a cent unless we've got to. We're going to go to America. Well, that took some doing, but we skimped and saved. But I haven't told you something very, very important. How I discovered that Ellen White was far from infallible. I'm still a teenager, now 15, living at 23 Lily Street, Enfield, Sydney, and reading again one day the book of Hebrews, I came across these words in Hebrews 6 at the close. We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. It enters the inner sanctuary behind the curtain. KJV, I think it says, within the veil. But modern versions agree with this NIV, where Jesus, who went before us, has entered on our behalf. He has become a high priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Now, the main work of the high priest was the Day of Atonement. He didn't do the trivial things that ordinary priests did, but on the 10th day of the 7th month every year, he did the great atonement work, slaughtered about 15 animals, went twice within the veil. Laborious work, lonely work, no one helped him, perhaps even dangerous work. They tied a rope to his ankle that if he was struck down within the sanctuary, they could pull him out. So I read this verse about Christ going into the inner sanctuary, but I had read in great controversy that Christ only went into the equivalent of the inner sanctuary. I say the equivalent because Ellen White says the heavenly sanctuary no imagination can picture. There 10,000 times 10,000 bow low before God. And of course the book of Hebrews says that the inner sanctuary is heaven itself, Hebrews 9. Well, I read on and came to chapter 9, and I read these verses in chapter 9, verses 7 and 8. When everything had been arranged, the priests entered regularly into the outer room to carry on their ministry. But only the high priest entered into the inner room, and that only once a year, and never without blood, which he offered for himself and for the sins of the people had committed in ignorance. The Holy Spirit was showing by this that the way into the most holy place had not yet been disclosed as long as the first tabernacle was still standing. And then in verse 12, he did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, having obtained eternal redemption. And then a little further on, Christ did not enter a man-made sanctuary. There was only a copy of the true one. He entered heaven itself, now to appear for us in God's presence. Nor did he enter heaven to offer himself again and again, the way the high priest enters the holy place every year with blood that's not his own. then Christ would have had to suffer many times since the creation of the world. But now he's appeared once for all at the end of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself. So Christ was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many people, and he'll appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him. Now remember, this is a boy of 15, but I'd read Hebrews before. First time I read it, I was about 11. But it was saying very clearly that what Ellen White said in the book Great Controversy was wrong. She, of course, just reflected where the Advent people were at that time. All her interpretation of prophecy in that book are just a reflection of where Adventism was at that time. Ellen White never claimed to be a theologian. Her main emphasis was live like Jesus, reflect Jesus to other people. Thus we may hasten his return. Usually she copied what was being said by those around her in Great Controversy, does that over and over. And the fifth explanation that Adventists came up with for why Christ didn't come in 1844 was not the one it should have been. It should have been Christ forbade date setting. Acts 1 verse 7. It's not for you to know the dates. That should have been their explanation why he didn't come in 1844. All the dates that Adventists came up with were all wrong. Not one of them is correct. Not even the date they give for the death of Christ, a date I've often used when I'm speaking to Adventists. But it's not correct. He did not die in 1831. We're not sure when, more likely 1830. The dates given by Adventists for the papacy, 538-79, quite wrong. Papacy was dominant in the world for only between 2 and 3 centuries after 538. 538 was one of the worst years the Pope ever had. And besides that, the Eastern Orthodox Church never accepted Rome. So a huge proportion of Christians were not under the papacy. The people in the East never were, never became so. So here I am, a boy of 15, a very dedicated Seventh-day Adventist. Had I not become a vegetarian, had I not risked losing my loved one's friendship, my brother stopped talking to me when I became an Adventist. He didn't talk to me for 20 years. I'd promised my grandparents I'd never become an Adventist, and I broke that promise. So I was a very earnest Adventist, and here I find, as I read Hebrews 6 and 9 and chapter 10, and later in Hebrews, that Great Controversy was wrong when it said Christ went in the second apartment in 1844. There's not one line in the New Testament to support that Adventist idea. Matter of fact, if you're talking to a friend who is an Adventist who believes in investigative judgment, pass him a New Testament. Say, find it here. It's not there. Now, Adventists for years have struggled with these verses. The original Hebrew, instead of most holy place, usually has tahagia, which has more than one meaning. Can mean the whole sanctuary, can mean the first apartment, can mean the 2 apartments. But the context in each case that I've mentioned, once a year, blood of bull and goats, only the high priest, makes it very clear that this Greek expression, translated by modern versions as the most holy place, that's exactly what it meant. So Ellen White was wrong. A godly woman. I remember when I went to Michigan State University, there was a man there called Horace J. Shaw, and he'd been 3 years there. corresponding with the people that heard Ellen White speak. And he gathered up the evidence from over 480 public discourses Ellen White gave in 82 cities and towns. Now, this is the woman who wrote 100,000 pages, probably more than any other woman who ever lived. This is a woman who in her 80s crossed USA to and back, taking scores of talks. This is a woman who had an accident when she was very young and suffered from ill health all her life. This is a woman who opposed the leaders of her church and was exiled to Australia and did a wonderful work there. I have talked to people who knew Ellen White. I did that 60, 70 years ago. And they all gave the same story. A loving, godly woman with a sense of humour, with a great interest in the poor, the sick and the suffering. I remember Mrs. Thorpe at Avondale, who'd been a secretary. In the 1940s, she told me, my first year at Avondale, 1947, how Ellen White would harness up horse and a cart, fill it with food and clothes, go down to Doral Creek and distribute it to the poor. Well, anyway, Horace Shaw, Michigan State University, wrote a book on the speaking of Ellen White. And the head of rhetoric there, Dr. Kenneth Hance, was very impressed by what he read in Horace Shaw's dissertation. And at the oral examination, other people who'd read the dissertation expressed similar amazement about a woman who'd had no education, who'd suffered from sickness all her life, who's written 100,000 pages, could take all these public discourses, over 480, 82 cities and towns. So I have to say again, I'm no bitter opponent of Ellen White, but I refuse to use her as a Bible or to consider her infallible. After I read these passages, from the age of 15, I spent at least 30 years trying to solve the problem. I wrote a lot of material for the church dealing with the problem. But at the end of 30 years, I knew I had not solved it. I was a failure. I had not found the key to why Ellen White should contradict Scripture in great controversy, when Hebrews 6 and chapter 9 and 10 were so clear that Christ went into the heaven of heavens to the side of God. 12 times, the Bible says, he sat down on the right hand of God. So there was still a problem. But something happened. Very amazing. Undoubtedly, the will of God. I was kept at Avondale through the kindness of Dr. Murdoch when they should have sacked me. And the conference that picked me up promised to pay my debt. First of all, I sent to Coffs Harbour. I had a car as old as I was, came out in 1929, and visiting the saints far from Coffs Harbour, I came down a mountain road that had all sorts of gullies. After rain, everything was wet. I had just let off a hitchhiker. Usually my mother would have been with me, but not this time, strangely and wonderfully. And suddenly my front wheels hit a gully and the steering wheel twisted in my hands and my car went over the side, turned over 4 times with me in it, and hit the mud water at the bottom of this great gulf. I remember thinking to myself, lie down, you won't break too many bones. I got out and sat on the battery. I don't advise that. I don't recommend that. But I was very dazed. Up and down the hill were prophetic charts and a raincoat etc., etc. That night I took Bible studies in the home to which I had been going. And then through the night 100 times, I repeated the accident. Coffs Harbour newspaper, said evangelist car falls 60 feet. God had a reason for preserving me. After Coffs Harbour, I went to Corinda. I was now married. We lived in a caravan for a year. There was a shed there that housed my books. Some of those books in my library now are over 100 years old. But at Corinda, I took about 85 meetings. A number of people were baptised. Then Gunnedah, I used to teach at the school, and many children came who weren't Adventists, and certain of these were baptised at the end of my year. So from Gunnedah I went to Inverell, and there something very providential happened. I pastored a church, very happy church. But then a man came to town by the name of Pastor Bergen, Church of Christ man. Now the old pastors in former Church of Christ were very much debaters. And from the beginning of their church, they chose to debate with opponents. And they were usually very, very good. And this man, Bergen, was a debater. And it was his hobby to debate Seventh-day Adventist pastors and to trounce them, whether it was New Zealand or West Australia or Victoria, wherever. But he had victory after victory over Adventist pastors. So now this man comes to Inverell. I'm a young man in my 20s, and all I'd heard of Pastor Bergen filled me with fear and concern and anxiety. Then I got an invitation to attend a special celebration for the return of Pastor Bergen to Inverell. So I went, fearfully aware of what might happen. He sought me out. He said, I want to debate you. Well, I didn't tell him how I felt. I said, okay, every night for a month. Well, no, he said, that won't be necessary. I said, well, every night for a week. No, he said, that's not necessary. I said, well, at least let's debate all one day. No, he said, we're going to debate just one night. I said, well, if you advertise it for one night, I'll advertise it for beginning the night before. So, with much prayer and much study, and in the providence of God, I managed to get a copy of a debate he'd taken years before. I was a bibliophile. I had collected books on the Sabbath that most Adventists didn't have. So I studied and studied and studied. And the night came. The room was filled with Roman Catholics, Anglicans, Presbyterians, Methodists, Adventists, Church of Christ. I remember my wife Gwen, pregnant with Ellen, giving her a seat to an old lady while she stood alongside the wall for hours. And the debate went for 40 minutes each, 30 minutes each, 20 minutes each, 10 minutes each. Well, I was very afraid, but God was very good to me. And it wasn't long before Pastor Bergen's face was distorting, and he suddenly looked ugly, and he was very unhappy. And after that debate, I baptised certain of his flock. But when the church heard about it, Adventist workers had sent a message, "Forward slays the dragon." Well, that was an exaggeration, but it did look as though Adventism had come out on top. Now, among the people in leadership at time was Pastor Sibley. Pastor David Sibley I had met in a very private place at Avondale one day, first time we talked together, but he became my friend. And after I graduated and I was appointed to New Zealand, he met Gwen on the campus and said, "Won't you tell Des I'd like to have him here in New South Wales? I've got too many Kents. I want to get rid of one or two of them, and I'd like him to come." "Oh," she said, "he's very set on New Zealand. He's heard it's a great place for evangelism." "Well," said Sibley, "do what you think best, but I'd like to have him if he comes. But if he comes, he'll have to do colporteur work." I hated the very thought of colporteur work. I still say I wouldn't have missed it for $1,000, but I wouldn't go through it again for $1 million. But it's a very good education. But I was bookish. I wasn't used going to door, trying to talk people into buying books. So Sibley said, if he comes, he'll be canvassing for months. But then he'll work with George Burnside. Well, that's the greatest name at that time among Adventist evangelists in Australia and New Zealand. So Gwen said, I'll go to the house, which was the office at Avondale. If it's crowded, I'll take as a signal not to bother. If it's not crowded, I'll try and contact Des and Counsel, where I was walking the streets. I couldn't get a job because of the Sabbath. And I told myself this was a great privilege, but I wasn't terribly happy about it. I ended up working for the conference office there because I could type. Gwen contacted me and I decided to accept Pastor Sibley's invitation. He sent me to Coffs Harbour. He sent me to Corindi. He sent me to Gunnedah. He sent me to Inverell. And one night, after he'd baptised some of my converts, we travelled all night together down to Newcastle. And I told him my concerns from Hebrews chapter 6 and chapter 9 and chapter 10, that Ellen White was wrong in great controversy. He said, Des, I know all about it. He said, I was appointed by the union to oppose W.W. Fletcher. Now, W.W. Fletcher was one of the most saintly Adventists that ever lived. Even those that disagreed with him said he was a saint. He taught at Avondale, and he was greatly loved. But he found the same problem I had found, and he left the church, wrote a book called Reasons for My Faith, and Sibley had to fight him. I said, how did you get on? Well, said Sibley, I found he was right. I said, what? You, an Adventist conference president, you're telling me W.W. Fletcher was right and Ellen White was wrong? Yes, said Pastor Sibley. But Des, remember this, every church has its problems. Every church has some errors. There are many, many good things in Adventism. Well, he was a good friend. And after the debate with Bergen, he spoke to the other men in the division office and said, we should send this boy to America. First of all, let him go back to Avondale because there were no degrees when he graduated. Let him get his BA, then let him go to Potomac University, the Adventist University in Washington, D.C., and let him get a BD and then come back, take over the Bible department because Pastor Burns is very old. He's going to have to leave it soon. So because of Sibley, Gwen and I set off on the Arcadia, beautiful P&O liner. Not so many people flew those days. This is the 50s. And we got to America, where I attended Potomac University, an Adventist university. And to my horror, I found that many people in that university knew about the things I had discovered in Hebrews, and they had given up faith in investigative judgment. I remember Ivan Lazen, who became a much respected teacher at Andrews University and at Loma Linda. He was the first one at Potomac University said, "Des, the idea of investigative judgment is wrong." And I found that Loseby, the man who taught Greek, jeered at the teaching of investigative judgment. Heppenstall, who was the best theologian among Adventists at the time and a very godly man, Heppenstall had the same problems I had. I'd written to him from Australia years earlier, and I can still see his reply. No margins, just single-space replies, acknowledging the problems I had brought up. So Heppenstall was teaching there. And one day, Heppenstall caught me as I was walking along a corridor. He said, "This is ridiculous, the brethren sending you here to work on a BD." He said, "BDs are a dime a dozen. You should begin a PhD. Do what you can. You've only been given 2 years in this country. Do what you can. Come back another time and finish it. Get a PhD, not a BD." So I wasn't terribly keen because Potomac University, like every university, had good and bad teachers. Some teachers I thought were terrible. Others I thought were wonderful. Heppenstall was a great teacher. Dr. Murdoch was. Weniger was there. He was a wonderful teacher and a wonderful Christian. He suffered terribly in his later years from back disease. I remember going to the president of Potomac University and saying, "I wouldn't have crossed the road for some of your teachers, and here I've crossed the world." But anyway, when Heppenstall suggested I should begin a PhD, I wasn't terribly keen because of my experience with some of the teachers at Potomac. But other teachers were very good. I remember Winton Bevan. He was a wonderful teacher, and he'd taken articles of mine and sent them to the ministry to be published. Well, I agreed because it was Heppenstall, and he wrote the Australian leaders, and men got off planes near to midnight, met in the division office and talked about changing my plan, giving me permission to begin a PhD. So it ended up I got an MA at Potomac University on Daniel 8:14 because Heppenstall had asked me to take some classes on the subject. I said, "I'll do it if you let me turn them into a thesis for an MA." He said, "Okay." So I got an MA. But then the puzzle was where to go. I looked at all the catalogues, and the religion they offered was often modern liberalism. I wanted an evangelical school. And Winton Bevan said to me, "Des, you should go to Michigan State University, do a PhD in rhetoric. That'll help you as you teach preaching, and it'll help you in all sorts of other ways because you do all sorts of other subjects." He said, "Your teacher will be Kenneth Hance, who was my tutor." And that's how I got a PhD. Go to Michigan State University. So I went there, and God was very good to me there because I decided that if only I could do my thesis at the same time as the classes. You know the difference between American PhDs in English. When I went to England, all I did was sit in library chairs and sit beside a typewriter. You didn't have to do classes for your PhD if you had some earlier degrees. But the Americans different. I did about 100 exams at Michigan State University, did many courses, but God worked for me. One of my professors asked me to write an essay on the ethics of rhetoric. I said, "I'll do it if I can stay away from your classes to write it, and if it can go on my dissertation." He said, "Done, you can do it." So there were things like that that saved me a lot of time. I asked my tutor, "Can I write my dissertation same time as doing class?" He said, "Why not? why not? So I took a few days off and went to Chicago, lived in a YMCA room where you weren't allowed to eat. I used to eat in the snow at the entrance of the YMCA building where I stayed, where I went around universities, photostating stuff I would need for my dissertation. Then back at Lansing, Michigan State University, I would spend 10 hours or more every Sunday on my dissertation. And at the same time, I preached about 50 times in Adventist churches. And I was offered planes to fly me, cars to drive me, and I've spoken about 50 churches. Neil Wilson's father asked his treasurer to send me a cheque when he heard I was leaving America. He said, "This boy's done a lot for us, send him a cheque." Well, I didn't mind that at all, and I happened to like Neil Wilson's father. And so I was able to finish a PhD in about 17 months. And when I left at the end of 1960, I had my MA and PhD. And on the way home, we stopped at PUC, where Graham Maxwell was. Graham Maxwell was one of Adventism's saints. He came from a great family. His father was Uncle Arthur, who wrote the bedtime stories. Jill saw some of those years before she was an Adventist and felt God was in them. They influenced her. So when we got to PUC, everyone was so kind. It was snowing. But I talked to Graham Maxwell about my problems with Hebrews. He knew all about it. He agreed with me. I said, "What do you do?" He said, "Just tell them the good news about Jesus." He was very much a moral influence man that stressed that Christ's cross was meant to break our hearts and make us good people. He didn't regard the cross as a propitiation. But he was a great man and a good man. And he made it easier for me with my problem because here was someone teaching at PUC that knew the problems. In later years, I found out that when Fred Veltman taught there at PUC, he admitted there was nothing in the theory of the investigative judgment. He influenced Dale Ratzlaff, who, when he was badly, very badly treated by his leaders in the church, and Dale left, he knew from Fred Veltman that the investigative judgment was wrong. And the time he left, I was in trouble. Anyway, we got back to Australia, and I said to Pastor Sibley, "What am I to do? I find many people in America don't believe in the investigative judgment anymore, and I have to teach at Avondale. What am I to do?" Pastor Sibley advised me to teach the traditional positions, but explain some of the problems and give the best answers I could. This I did for many years. But I had made many enemies within a few years of teaching at Avondale. I did what Heppenstall did in America. I emphasised the gospel of the free grace of God, of the mercy of God, of imputed righteousness, covering the sinner perfectly from the moment he believes, despite failures, despite mistakes. I taught this, and it upset many of the older ministers. Years earlier, when I'd worked with Burnside, he used to meet with his team and ask, "Do they have any questions?" And one day I asked him this question: "Why is it that we see most names in the book of Revelation as symbolic, but you stress that Megiddo is literal?" Well, that was a very dangerous thing to say, and I made a man my enemy for years. He took me aside and accused me of having a big head, which may have been true. Then for years he tried to get rid of me from the ministry. When I was in America, someone in America sent him my program where I was going to preach different cities. And Pastor Burnside would send papers against the doctor of doubt, urging people to turn against me. So here's Sibley telling me what to do, and I do it, and I preach the gospel, but I make another enemy. Pastor Parmenter. I'd been very good friends with Pastor Naden, Pastor Frame. We loved each other, got on very well. But it was different when Pastor Parmenter came in. The extreme right-wing people, the ultra-traditionalists said, either you get rid of Ford or we'll get rid of you. And so he arranged that I should go to America, PUC, and he saved his own skin. And after a year, he was urged to keep me there by Australian right-wingers. So he arranged I should stay on. But at that time, Robert Brinsmead came to America. Now, Bob and I had been good friends when he was at college, though we argued because I disagreed with his perfectionism. He had an end-time perfectionism. I disagreed. But our disagreement didn't alter our friendship. But here he is in America, and he's changed his mind on the investigative judgment. So people everywhere are asking questions. And the forum at PUC asked me if I would take a meeting for the forum on the investigative judgment. I said, it'll only cause trouble. It's not safe. They said you can say anything you like in a forum. It's sacrosanct. It's safe. And so I worked very hard, prepared a meeting. We thought we might get 100 or 200 people, but 1,000 people came. We had to shift from the music centre, which would have held 200, to Irwin Hall, which could hold 1,000. And people were very warm in their responses and in their questions. And Dr. Syme, who had been appointed to answer me and reply to me, when I finished, he stood up and he says, I have nothing to say against what Dr. Ford has said. I agree with him. Well, when this word got the General Conference, if they'd been wise, would have turned me back into coal porter work. Why on earth did they call the leaders of the church from all over the world, something that would cost about $1 million? Why did General Conference ask me to write a document and call in the leaders from all over the world? Why that? Because God was in it, that's why. And so I was given 6 months away from PUC to prepare a document for a week's trial at Glacier View. I was writing it to answer any objections that people might think of to what I was teaching. When I say teaching, I did not teach against investigative judgment until I gave the forum talk. And then I did tell of how many letters I received from ministers saying they were so troubled about Daniel 8:14. This is the book I wrote. In the original, nearly 100 pages. Jill has been the saint who's typed all my materials, and I've written about 40 books. Jill at the moment is redoing this on the net for a new copy. It will soon, in a matter of months, be available. But anyway, I had Jill's help for 6 months, and this tells the story of the forum and the talk that I gave, and it gives Dr. Syme's response, and it also has a chapter on about 22 assumptions that underlie the investigative judgment, all of which cannot be answered. All of it is here. Well, at Glacier View, we found most people very friendly. The only person who wasn't friendly to me was Neil Wilson, who insulted me publicly when I was standing answering questions. And after he insulted me, I put my things together and left the podium. Then they had to write a consensus statement, and Bill Johnson and Fritz Guy and Duncan Eva, I think, had most to do with it. And the consensus statement agreed with what I'd written here in at least 7 to 12 places. For example, it said the year-day principle is nowhere explicitly taught in the Bible. And it made it clear that Christ could have come back any time after the destruction of Jerusalem if the church had been faithful, taking the gospel of the world. It didn't have to be in 1844. Well, Neil Wilson said we won't use the consensus statement. They buried it. You've not seen it reprinted in all the years since 1980. It was buried because it supported what I had written. And then Jill and I were called for Prexad on the last afternoon of the week and accused of many things, including accused of collaborating with Robert Brinsby, which was not true. We knew Bob, but we did not collaborate with him to harm the church, but we were accused of it. They got it from Bob's brother, who was angry because Bob had given up the investigative judgment. And so I was told that I could be given a job in Sanitarium Health Food Factory. I repudiated this kind offer and felt that it was soon time to go to Australia and be beachcombers for a little while till the Lord turned something up. But God turned something up in America. People who'd heard me preach got together. Good News Unlimited was formed and has been going until this day. I should mention the official grounds for my being sacked was something that was never officially agreed on or voted on. Elder Wilson was a very clever administrator. He asked several men to write statements of where they thought I differed from traditional Adventism, not what was contrary to the Bible, but where I differed from traditional Adventism. They came up with 10 points where I differed. So I said the year-day principle was not biblical. One of the European Conference presidents did his PhD on the year-day principle, and in 100 ways showed it was dead, that it was false, that historicism as a method of interpretation was not biblical. He wrote a book called The End of Historicism, Kai Arasola. And so the 10-point statement was the basis on which I was sacked. God has been good to us. God has provided for Jill and me. My first wife died after 7 years of cancer, a wonderful woman who never complained. And Jill has been my helper, done so much for me, so many things I couldn't do for myself. And GNU has prospered. helping thousands of people in scores of countries all over the world. Eliezer Gonzalez is now the president of Good News Unlimited. He's a good writer and a good speaker, and he knows the gospel. I can only say God has been good to us, and part of his goodness was the influence that Ellen White had upon me, that despite her mistakes in theology and history, she was a godly woman who uplifted Jesus and helped me to love my Saviour more. So Jill and I thank God for his merciful providences, including his providences through a woman who's never been as fully appreciated as she should be. God bless you.